We have questions pouring in. Let's see what we have.
Yeah.
Questions are there already?
Well, it was 3 great talks, and I think that what is very interesting, there are some overlapping themes, and they've also been picked up very well by the audience. So I'm going to take the liberty to address as many questions as possible to sometimes combine them a little bit in the same theme.
Let's do that.
And I think one thing that, to start with Professor Cuijpers, is that a few questions came up about that precision psychiatry is not only about which type of disorder or factor, but also about severity. And you actually also talked about severity. But how does this framework and these predictions, can they not be different for people with mild depression? Does that have implications for therapy or psychopharmaco? And also at the other extreme end with more severe patients. Several questions wanted to know about how that would impact your claims.
Yeah, so the conventional meta-analysis, the network meta-analysis, so not the IPD meta-analysis I talked about, almost all these studies are done in moderate and severe depression. So we can separate severe and moderate depression, but there is hardly any research on moderate depression. We know from other meta-analysis that pharmacotherapy doesn't work when people don't have a depressive disorder at all. So for mild depression, actually we don't know. So there is no knowledge about what works. In these IPD meta-analysis, you can go a step further because you have the individual data. And what we did in one of these IPD meta-analysis is we looked at severity as a predictor. And we did not find that severity is a predictor, meaning that CBT and pharmacotherapy have comparable effects across the whole spectrum.
Okay.
And that means, I saw one of the other questions, that I think psychotherapy is not used enough in severe depression.
Yeah.
And I really think that the evidence is pretty clear, combined treatment is best.
Yeah.
So if you have a severe depressed case, you should give the combination. What happens is that a lot of patients give the impressions that they're not ready for psychotherapy. And then it's an easy decision to say, okay, we start with pharmacotherapy, and then when that works, we will go to combined treatment.
Yes. Clear conclusion.
Very clear and good implication for the field, I think.
Another one.
Another one, I think it's a bit for both Jehannine Austin and Wouter.
Okay, the both of you. Yes.
There are several questions about, I think the first one is, why is it actually called genetic counseling and not like causal counseling or environmental counseling?
Yes, please, let's
hear so much
your
more.
Answer, yeah.
I love that question, and I'm delighted that it's been asked. So genetic counselling is really the name of the model or the discipline that I was trained in, and it's what we do in genetic counselling. It is misleading but I have spent a lot of time playing in my head with other names that we could call it.
Yes, like what?
None of them are very good. Etiological counselling, nobody knows what etiology is. And it's not just environmental counselling either. It's really a holistic thing. We talk about it all together. So I think the quickest answer is literally just that genetic counselling is a profession, and the model that we're doing in psychiatric genetic counselling is applying that in this context. So please know that we don't just talk about genetics. Yes.
Yes,
very clear.
And if you allow me to go to Wouter, because you just showed us that there's another question about that for instance, people wonder, if you have very severe genetic disorder, so to speak, where genetics sort of predicts the severity, you could say, that they're often less easily to treat. So here's the argument of counseling in terms of addressing someone's whole context, and your talk was more about the impact of severity on prognosis.
So, which I called the P factor, by the way. Yeah. So it was one of the questions.
Maybe you should explain a little bit what the P factor is, because not everybody knows it.
P factor is actually the psychiatric vulnerability factor.
Vulnerability is a word that the three of you use.
And there's a lot of overlap between our talks, I think. We look at the same building with a different light, but we see the same building, to put it that way. I would say that the large percentage of our population, of course, is in the middle of this Gaussian curve. And I tended to focus on the severity group more and more and more and more and more.
Yeah.
But that's, of course, the extreme of the outcome spectrum and the severity spectrum. These are, in my case, I'm a child psychiatrist, so I see children and youngsters who are with a genetic syndrome who are severely impaired. Yeah. So they have medical conditions, mostly lower IQs, etc., etc. And these people need long-term treatment, but actually they need our guidance during their whole life. And the point I want to make is that the large group of us, of all of us, have some vulnerability, which is different.
We all do, that's what you said.
Yeah, we all do. So if you talk about stigma, it's really ridiculous to give a stigma if you know that all of us are vulnerable to some extent.
Yeah. Would you agree, Ms. Austin? Yeah.
Absolutely. That was one of the slides that I showed, was talking about using the JAR model to show how everybody in the population has some genetic vulnerability.
Right.
And I talked about how powerful that can be for patients to hear, that they're not defective or different or biologically broken in any way, that we all have some genetic vulnerability.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, good.
And I think that brings us to a next question in this respect, that people ask explicitly, why is it so difficult to arrange genetic screening for vulnerable children, for instance? And the next question then would be that if we do so, how would we arrange this type of genetic counseling in Holland? But maybe the first part is for you. Yeah.
I don't know, I usually think ladies first, but okay.
Now in terms of the screening, because that's for the Dutch situation, I think.
So screening is difficult because, how put it simple, you have a lot of genetic variations, really a lot. And the field of genetics moves ahead before we actually know the psychiatric phenotype. So the first problem you encounter is that a lot of variants are seen. We expect that they are disruptive, have large effects, but before you know what the makeup of that disruption is, you need to do research, you need to build cohorts. And if these are rare variants, it's really hard work to get a cohort. And my point is that you still should do that, because this group of people is really impaired. So they need medical services, they need psychiatric services, and to bring these together is really an effort.
But if we learn from Professor Austin, it is not only about the actual genetic finding, it's also about what comes next, that if somebody is ascertained either for a genetic abnormality or something in the family, what's next?
So for parents, I would say, for instance, that would be phenomenal to do genetic counseling for parents with a child with a severe genetic syndrome. Because they have stress levels that are terrible. We know that from our own studies.
She's nodding.
I am nodding vigorously. In agreement. And in fact, so genetic counselling as a profession, to my understanding, doesn't yet exist in the Netherlands. However, you do have a colleague of mine, Roberta Baker, who is championing the idea that maybe we should look into that for the Netherlands. There's the potential opportunity for some beautiful interdisciplinary collaboration, I think, between genetic counsellors and psychiatrists in exactly these kinds of areas. So, beautiful.
So that would be a co-production then between geneticists and psychiatrists?
Yes, exactly. How would you feel about that, Pim?
Yeah, I would first want to see the evidence, personally, with all due respect. But I think you also need... Sorry?
What evidence?
The evidence for what exactly?
For the effects of genetic counseling.
Okay.
Because what I would...
I'm delighted to share it.
Yeah, because I would like to see, for example, comparisons with conventional psychotherapy. Because if you go in Holland to a psychiatric institute, you get a very extensive history of your family, your especially in child and adolescent services. You get a lot of history of how you got, what your parents had. And so I think it's very comparable to what you actually do in your work. So it wouldn't surprise me very much if your genetic counseling would actually have comparable effects to psychological treatments.
I think
maybe she wants to respond. Yeah.
There's also a question about this.
Thank you so much. So I've actually written about and published on how, in fact, genetic counselling should be considered as a form of psychotherapy. It's a very circumscribed and time-limited form of psychotherapy. But I do absolutely see it that way. So you won't get any disagreement on your last point from me.
Good. So we agree on that as well. Yep. One sentence. Yes.
One thing pops up. It also depends on your outcome variable. So if we would measure like specific psychiatric symptoms, instead of, for instance, quality of life, you may find different findings. I don't know if that's in your studies, because that is really difficult to grasp in all the data.
Yeah, that's difficult to measure. But usually you find that if you find effects on the symptoms, that also the quality of life improves. So I'm not convinced that you will find differential effect between different approaches. I haven't seen that. And so at least for depression, we have lots of types of therapy. And this would just be another one, which also works.
Absolutely.
Which would be good.
I want to...
Yeah, please. So
what we know, as you know, what we know about therapy, it's the particular modality matters a lot less than the working alliance, the therapeutic relationship between the patient and the counsellor. So we know that's something established, obviously.
I wouldn't agree with that.
You wouldn't.
Well, you can hang on for afterwards.
You have to talk a little more, because there's only time.
I want to give the last word to the audience, because I think there's a very nice question here, which is very practical and something I think we all struggle with. That you refer to that we all take family histories. But the question here is but how do we actually validate whether these familial histories are true and they really have an effect in terms of impacting genetic counseling?
Yeah. Well, please. Last question.
Well, that's for me. Oh, sorry. Right.
Yeah,
okay. So family history matters in a couple of different ways in genetic counselling, right? One is simply as a tool to understand what somebody's experience has been with psychiatric illness in their family, and to use it to help understand where their explanation for cause of illness is coming from, right? And in that sense, the specific diagnoses actually it doesn't matter so desperately much, right? It's important to get a sense of what the patient's explanation is. The other way in which family history matters, though, of course, is if the patient wants to talk about what the chance is for somebody else in the family, a child, for example, to develop a condition, then the specific diagnoses within the family do become more important, because as we heard, there's no genetic testing, so we can't predict whether or not somebody will get illness based on genetic testing. So we have to use our best estimates with the empiric data that exist in the context of the family history. However, as the psychiatrists will know better than I, psychiatric diagnoses can change over time as people experience different symptoms, etc. So basically what we do is we take the history as given to us by the patient. We do not go chasing after records, because that would be incredibly time intensive. We may not be successful. And what we do is we basically provide risk estimates for people with the caveats around, assuming that this is the diagnosis, this is the person has, this is what the chance would look like. If in fact they have this other thing, it might look like this instead. So we're always very careful to communicate as clearly and as we can with patients about those caveats.
I think this is a very clear answer to this question.
Yes. All right. Well, we could have taken more time for this.
Well, I think it's a very lovely...
Oh, yes.
Sure. I really want to thank you all, because it's a lovely discussion, and thank you all the participants for entering your questions. Like we said before, we will try and send them to you, and then you can see what you can do with these questions, or if you want to get into it later. Yes? Okay. Thank you. Thank you so much. Speakers, thank you, Ms. Austin. We're going to conclude now and end the conference. Bye, Canada.
Thank you very much. Have a nice day.
Thanks so much. That was wonderful. Thank you.